What's hanging, young hero, besides your head and spirit? That soul is saying something profound. So
Welcome to the very first episode of Giant Size Violence, an UltraMega podcast. I'm your host, Grant.
And I'm your co-host today, the other Grant.
And today, we're going to be taking a look at the first issue of our new favorite comic series, UltraMega, by James Harren. A series that completely captured our interest in just a single issue, so much so that I decided to make a podcast talking about it.
So I really loved this book, but the only reason I read it or found out about it in the first place, was on a recommendation from you. So what was it that drew you to UltraMega, Grant?
So I kind of stumbled on this issue in a comic book store the week it came out. Someone saw me picking up an issue of Ultraman from Marvel and thought I would like this as well, because this actually draws a lot of influence from the character Ultraman, who's a huge deal in Japan and part of this genre that I love, but very few people among my other superhero-loving friends actually know about, called Tokusatsu, which encompasses Ultraman, Godzilla, Power Rangers, and all of the similar shows that have people in latex suits fighting people in rubber monster costumes. Just cheesy things that I love, but, kind of go underappreciated in America for the most part. Now, this book acts as just a love letter to all of that, so it's playing right up my alley immediately. But I noticed as I started suggesting this to other people, both those that share these interests with me and those who don't, it was getting resoundingly positive feedback. Even my friends that have no idea what Ultraman is or who didn't even watch Power Rangers growing up, they've had very good things to say about the series after reading it. So I kind of realized that even though this is something written for me, it's written well enough that there's a lot of appeal to it. So that was my number one reason for picking this book, is I want to talk about this, I want other people to read it, and I also really want to do deep dives into the genre that it's pulling from, since, Ultraman is like the Superman of Japan, like as far as, clout and just being a major pop culture icon among their superhero storytelling, and almost none of my friends here know who that even is. So I feel like this gives me a good chance to talk up what's literally my new favorite comic book, as well as a weird genre that I think could use a little more attention that a lot of my favorite comic books of recent years have been pulling from. Now, on top of it just having references to things I love, the art and the writing in this are incredible, and they're both done by the same guy, James Harren. The writing and art alone would make me suggest this to someone, but it goes beyond that. Like, not only does he write a good story, draw it well, but he also addresses a lot of the biggest complaints I have about the comic book industry. For one, instead of being just 20 pages barely introducing you to a story, he gives us a 60-page mini graphic novel as our first issue that gives us a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end that, as much as I would hate it, if UltraMega got canceled after this first issue, you would still have a complete experience just picking up this book. So that's not something you get from American comics very often nowadays, and on top of the fact that you don't need to know anything going in, you don't need to know years of history about other characters like you do with Marvel and DC books. So the fact that this book gives such a good storytelling experience and overcomes a lot of the biggest hurdles when it comes to introducing people to comic books makes this just a great hopping on point to anyone that at least likes one factor of this book. So if I know my friend liked Pacific Rim or Godzilla, I'm going to put this book in their hands. If I know they like comic books already, I'm going to put this book in their hand. If they like any level of violent superhero media, whether that's comic books, TV shows, or movies, I'm putting this book in their hand because I'm just so blown away by it. Really, the only people I'm not suggesting this to are anybody that's averse to high levels of violence, or as our title suggests, giant-sized violence. Since that's the one thing I will say is there's a big old content warning up front as far as just violence, gore, and anything along those lines go. So if that's not your jam, this book probably isn't for you. If you like anything else I mentioned, you'll love this book.
I will say I'm really glad that you recommended this to me for all of the things that you were gushing about. The art, just right off the bat from the cover, really piqued my interest, and it tied in so well with the writing. The scenes and the people are emotive in creative ways, and the ability to bring you up to speed on a very complex world and then give you a complete story was just a gift. So I thoroughly enjoyed this.
Yeah, and I want to say that up front, that this book is a masterclass of comic book storytelling, and I'll get into the specifics of that later on, but I think it'd be best if first we talk a little bit about the creative team here. Now, Grant, I know you're newer to comic books, but as far as our main cast here of our writer and artist, James Harren, our colorist, Dave Stewart, or letters by Russ Wooten, any of those names ring a bell to you in your comic experience?
No, I've never heard of any of those.
Yeah. I'm a lifelong comics reader. I even do another comic book podcast, but even for me, these were all new names, and partially because these are all fairly recent up-and-comers in the industry. They do have other books before this, and impressive ones at that. I mean, James Harren and Dave Stewart, I know, are both alumni of Hellboy. Dave Stewart doing colors, I believe, for the book itself, and James Harren writing for the spinoff BPRD. And for those who only know Hellboy for the movies from Guillermo del Toro, Hellboy is also known for having some of the best art and storytelling of any book among indie comics. So the fact that these two have worked on that really says something about the talent that's getting brought in here. Because Mike Mignola, Hellboy's creator, he is an artist himself, and he knows what he's doing. Like, I think James Harren is seen as a little bit of a protege in the field so far. And I'm not just trying to talk up a writer who made my new favorite book. I mean, he's got a lot of clout behind him. He's got Mike Mignola behind him. He's got the studio behind the Invincible comic books behind him. So very talented people are recognizing this talent and putting this book out there.
Yeah, with that kind of experience, it makes sense why this is your new favorite.
For those who also find an interest in this book, I'd really recommend you look into the previous work from these two, as they've collaborated on a book before called Rumble that also dealt with giant god-sized monsters fighting each other in more of a fantasy setting, but I think if giant monsters are your jam, you're gonna like Rumble as well. I honestly haven't read it yet, but I almost definitely will eventually for the sake of this podcast and my own enjoyment, since, yeah, I will read anything with their names on it at this point.
So now that we've sung all of the praises of this book generally, can you give us a quick recap on what's going on in issue 1? Like, what's this comic about?
Yeah, I'd actually like to start with the solicit for the first issue of the book. A cosmic plague is spread, transforming everyday people into violent, monstrous kaiju. Only the UltraMega, 3 individuals imbued with incredible powers, hold the line against this menace. Their battles level cities and leave untold horror in their wake. Now, the final reckoning approaches for the UltraMega. But is this a war they can even win? Our first chapter tells the story of the UltraMega's final battle against the kaiju, through the eyes of our protagonist Jason, the city's go-to giant defender with a secret connection to the coming threat. In a short 60 pages, this issue gives the reader everything they need to know about the world our heroes live in, delivers a kaiju battle far bloodier than anything seen in Godzilla or Pacific Rim, and sets the stage for the coming issues taking place in a world transformed by such a devastating conflict. Now, Grant, what were your first impressions after reading such an eventful and bombastic first issue of this series?
So I guess first I'd like to talk about my first impression before reading the issue. almost 70 pages seemed like a pretty big hurdle as opposed to what you typically see like a 20 or 30 issue comic. It was a short 60 pages, just like you said in the intro. There was so much story and so much build up to coming issues packed into such a small space. My first impression was just that it left me wanting more, but also feeling satisfied with what it was. I was really thankful to get a complete story at the end of this, but one that felt like it had a satisfying ending and where I knew everything that was going on. As someone who enjoys reading comics but doesn't read them avidly, I miss a lot of the references in more mainstream books to either other comics or other things that have happened. And in the first couple pages, they just bring you right up to speed.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to talk about specifically, is that this book takes 4 pages to give you an entire origin and backstory and setup to our main character and the world he lives in. And I mean, this isn't just like something simple like a guy gets bitten by a spider and now he has powers. Like, no, this is introducing the fact that a weird cosmic being gave him the offer of power to fight this cosmic virus, and this guy is a has-been fighter that's trying to make a name for himself again, and he's kind of given up all of his free time and his personal life doing this. That's 4 pages of comic that we find all of that out. A lot of comics would spend a whole issue or more just exploring that. But this tells you everything you need, and it just lets the story take off from there rather than waiting to build up to cool stuff happening in issue 2 and 3.
And not only do we get a concise but comprehensive backstory for the main character Jason, but we also get enough about the other two UltraMega to understand a little bit about who they are now, their motivations, and what they've been doing over the years.
Yeah, I really love that there's not a ton dedicated to Steven and Ern, the other UltraMega that we'll meet. But yeah, we get enough to know that there are these other players that are going to show up later. So even the side characters, they only get a few panels through the book, but they have complete stories through those few panels we see, and they are very fleshed out characters with less than probably 3 pages of total content dedicated to them throughout this book.
I guess at this point we've already talked about this a little bit, but what are your thoughts on the oversized length of this issue?
I honestly love it just because I've been getting frustrated with a lot of modern comics sticking to around 20 pages of book. I think they used to be longer back in the day. Maybe that was just padding with ads, which, by the way, this book doesn't have, so thank you guys for that. But I really like that they kicked this off with a 60-page mini graphic novel. For one, the reasons we've talked about earlier, how it gives us a complete story in a single book. But 2, I think that's just smart comic book storytelling. If you look at manga, which this takes a lot of inspiration from, most first chapters are longer than what we get later on. Like Naruto has that, Chainsaw Man has that. Most of the manga I've read so far have all had a much longer first chapter. And I think that's for a good reason, so it can engage new readers and make them interested in the story to come. And this does the same in that the first issue is 60 pages, the later ones are still oversized, but at 44 pages rather than a full 60. So I love it. I would much rather spend $8 on 3 times the comic content I get from your average book, especially when it's this high quality.
Like I've said before, it's a short 60 pages because there's so much implied storytelling and subtext between the panels that you get a lot more story than is even on the page. It works perfectly.
Absolutely, yeah. There's more in this first issue than a lot of graphic novels will give people. Like, I'm almost overselling it. Like, yeah, it is $7.99. Most comics are around $3.99 now, so it is twice as much, but I mean, I would say it's probably more than 3 times as much content than what you see in your typical comic book nowadays.
So, seeing that this is in the kaiju genre, and we get our first kaiju fight a few pages after the backstory and setup, what did you actually think about the kaiju fights themselves? Were they like ones that you've seen before? How were they different? Were there anything about these fights that really stuck out to you?
So, one thing I will say is that good kaiju fights are not that easy to find in the realm of comic books. So, for one, yes, I thought the action in this book was incredible. The choreography between the giants and the disparity between sizes really adds to it, but not only do they draw one hell of a kaiju fight here, they also do a lot of things I haven't seen in kaiju media before. Like having people get knocked out by just the concussive force of these things punching each other. Or seeing people drown in blood when one of them gets wounded. Like, that's some gruesome potential realism. I don't know the physics in any of this, but it's just a level of realism I've never seen in a kaiju film, even the really heavy R-rated ones. So that really grabbed my attention early on and made me feel like this is made for mature audiences. I mean, a lot of people have been making kaiju and tokusatsu content for older people. Like, the recent Power Rangers comics are very much geared to an older audience, but this blows it out of the park. This is like RoboCop levels of violence added to a Godzilla movie, and I love that.
Yeah, you mentioned the people drowning in blood. So at some point, one of the kaiju is killed by having its head torn off. And each time I read this, it always comes up unexpectedly that, yeah, there's a lot of blood in one of these giant monsters. So just a tidal wave of blood going through the street is always something that surprises and shocks me. But then after a couple seconds of surprise, I realized, of course, that would happen if this was realistic. A few of the other things that I thought seemed like realistic comic book fights of this scale, like these titanic monster battles, is just the sheer destruction we see of property. You know, it's not just a couple buildings getting smashed through like you might see in a superhero fight and like a car exploding here or there. There are entire streets of cars flung into the air and, 75% of a city getting destroyed just by them bumping into it or going through these buildings. I haven't seen many kaiju fights, but I was in awe of the sheer destruction and how realistic it seemed for battles of these scale.
Yeah, and really it's the framing of these fights too that really makes that chaos and level of damage really hit home, because modern kaiju media has been playing a little bit more with like showing large levels of destruction. Like the recent American Godzilla movies have done that. Pacific Rim's done that, and even Shin Godzilla a little bit. But this puts us at the ground level with characters that have names and faces we know. So when we see someone driving a car as the city's streets are like just getting subject to massive earthquakes, or seeing someone kick to try and not drown in a flood of blood, just really adds a level of it adds a level of emotion to this visceral violence that just really makes it stand out and makes you feel how terrible these things are. It's not just an excessive gore fest. Like, it's tugging at your heartstrings while it's showing you these terrible things.
Totally. And I think it's really appropriate that you described it as being on the ground level, because in addition to, in a literary and metaphorical sense, oftentimes just based on the perspective of the artwork, during the fights between these giant monsters, we are literally on the ground level. The perspective is from the same point of view as someone in the crowd or cars on the streets. So we're always looking up to these giant fights, or at least often are.
Yeah, and I think that's really what makes this hit home and what makes any entry in this genre work better than others. Or this is one of the main things people use to compare is like, does it make these big things feel big, or does it make it feel like a few people in bad costumes fighting in a fake city? And I mean, this being a comic book, it has a lot going for it to be able to sell that more than people fighting in rubber suits on a cheap set. But still, I've seen worse kaiju fights in comics, and I've seen things that just feel like superhero fights, but you're supposed to believe these people are giant, rather than just, typical sized heroes fighting. No, this makes you feel the sheer size of this giant size violence.
So I guess while we're talking about the art of these fights, what else did you think about the art of this book?
So one thing I love is how this doesn't really look like the other mainstream comics on the shelves right now. And it doesn't even really look like most indie comics that I've been following lately. It does have some level of indie look depending on what corners you're coming from. I can certainly see elements of the Hellboy art style here. But honestly, it reminds me a lot more of the really edgy and fringe indie comics that I've been exposed to just a little over the years. Like some of the more apocalyptic stuff we see here feels very reminiscent to Tank Girl. A lot of the imagery we see with the dystopian cities and robots and just various unpleasant dystopian society details feel like something I would see in an old comic zine like 2000 AD or Heavy Metal. So it's just going for a much more gritty and artistic indie comic style than I'm used to seeing on the shelves, even as someone who reads a fair amount of indie comics. So yeah, I think the art in this is incredible, and that's only made more so by the fact that it's done by the same guy writing all this.
Yeah, and there were a couple of things that I think spoke to what I said earlier about telling a lot of story between the panels. Like, for instance, during the kaiju fights, when people are trying to evacuate or get out of the way of either the monster or some other kind of danger, oftentimes their faces are either drawn very vaguely without a lot of features, or in some cases completely featureless. I noticed at least one person that was just a rough figure sketch, with the perspective lines on it, their face and everything. And then also the posing of the characters in a lot of panels, as well as the shading used, conveyed a lot of, I guess I don't know a better term for it than body language, where you get a lot of emotion from the scene, just the way the characters are portrayed in them. I thought that was a fantastic use of the artistic space that they had.
Yeah, and that's one thing I do want to harp on quick, is that the coloring in this is also amazing, and that's also a very important thing in any comic. So Dave Stewart is doing an incredible job here with that. There are certain panels I can pick out while I'm flipping through this book where it's almost like he's got an artistic filter he can apply panel to panel, showing everything being chaotic, terrible, and sickening in one moment, and then in the next using that same coloring and shading to make things look a little nicer and pleasant to show things are at a simpler time. Where I'm thinking of this specifically is where we see the flashback to Jason and his first marriage and the upcoming baby, and that some of the panels are in the moment, and we see through not just the lines on his face and the worried look, but also this green tint and coloring to the world that things are bad and he feels sick. Next panel, we get that soft, warm lighting in contrast to some more ominous stuff happening in the same panel. And then just a lot of back and forth in the upcoming panels. I'm not the most articulate art critic. I want to be upfront about that, but I can tell that this guy is doing wonders with the coloring here, and I don't want to just give James Harren all the credit here, since Dave Stewart is doing a lot of work as well with the colors.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just said the art, but I guess the artist and the colorist here are separate, and they both did phenomenal jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and can't say enough about that. And I always want to give credit where it's due. Every writer in the industry talks about how important letters are as well. Again, not something I can really speak to, but I can tell they're at least done well here, especially when anybody is like shouting or screaming. The way he does his exaggerated letter work works very well. He even kind of incorporates it into the sound effects in many moments, and it just adds a great level of sound to the comic. So please know that lettering is like the most undervalued skill in comics from what I hear. And yeah, one more thing that is done incredibly well in this amazing book.
That's a really good point because one of the action scenes, not one of the fights, but at some point Jason is frantically driving somewhere because he's just realized that something terrible is going on, and he thinks that he might be able to stop it if he makes it somewhere in time. So he's just borrowed a police car and is frantically driving to this location and then crashes the car. So during that, the perspective of the art, the coloring of the scene, and then the lettering, both the typeface used in the lettering as well as the arrangement of the sound effects really adds a depth to the scene where it turns into as action-packed a scene as you'll see in any book.
Yeah, it really does add motion to it using the lettering, coloring, and everything. So yeah, like when I say this book is a masterclass in storytelling, it's not just the writing and the concisiveness of it. Like the way the action is portrayed using every element of this creative team is incredible. It's comics at its finest. It feels like everyone is firing on all cylinders and really making this stand out among a market of other great indie books.
Another thing I appreciated about the art, and I guess I noticed mostly during the action scenes, was some of the things that were clearly influenced by manga and anime. So, for instance, the special moves that they use, they always shout out the names, and they use moves that are very reminiscent of, well, I guess for me, it was reminiscent of like a Dragon Ball Z fight. And then at one point during one of the fights, one of the UltraMega transforms into a different form, and it's very iconic. He's cloaked in energy, does a power stance, and all of that dissipates, and then he looks different, fiercer, and just leaps into the fight right after. Were there any other anime influences that you picked up on throughout the book?
Yeah, actually, that scene in particular actually reminded me of Neon Genesis Evangelion, more so than just like Dragon Ball or your typical shonen anime. Yeah, and for those who aren't aware, Neon Genesis Evangelion is a huge 90s mech anime that's been very influential. It's like the Watchmen of mech anime. But yeah, this could just be coincidence, but I thought what this character transforms into looks very much like the weird kind of fleshy robots from that anime, and the fight scene that ensues is also kind of reminiscent, and it's how fast-paced or how fast-moving these large people are, and just the kinetic energy of everything happening.
That was something I appreciated about a lot of the fight scenes. I mean, usually what I would expect to see is a longer, more drawn-out fight with thinking and maybe some dialogue between characters. And although we get a little bit of that at this final battle towards the end, both of the big fight scenes are incredibly quick. I mean, the first one's done in just a couple of pages of actual fighting. They're brutal, they're quick, and that seems a little bit more realistic than standing around and thinking. Like, they literally don't have time to think, and it's very clear.
Yeah, actually, absolutely. You're right there in that the action feels almost more fast-paced than what you see in a typical anime now. And yeah, it does add an urgency to this fight that the book emphasizes is going over a long period of time. There's even a cut to the next day at one point, and the fight is still happening. So yeah, weird how much high energy they put in that art, and it does feel like the most action-packed sequences in an anime, between all that dialogue and inner monologue. But as far as other anime references, I mean, this is kind of stretching more to the genre itself of Tokusatsu, but I mean, our main character visually is very reminiscent of Ultraman, with the fin on his head, the fact that he uses this little capsule-shaped thing to transform into this giant being with a some kind of symbol on his chest. That's all Ultraman right there, like down to a T. But as far as other references go, there was a major one that I don't know if this is just coincidence, I'm grasping at straws, or how intentional it is, but this first issue is very reminiscent to the last act of Beowulf, in my experience.
Okay, interesting.
We're going to get into a little bit of spoilers territory here, so sorry for this, guys. But, I mean, the whole dynamic of this fabled hero facing his final battle against basically his monstrous wife and their inhuman child, that's Beowulf to me. I mean, I am no Beowulf scholar, but that's all I was thinking of as I was going into this. Like,
Yeah, it's the same basic plot.
Yeah, and by the way, the imagery of that with, like, this being some kind of baby or spawn of the hero, that's done super well, and I can see the Hellboy in this book when we look at those scenes. Like, it's very eldritch horror. Our first time seeing the kaiju our heroes are going to fight, we see it in a giant womb. And I didn't pick up on that till my second time reading this, that, like, yeah, it's just this giant primordial womb that this thing is literally given birth through. It's gruesome and disgusting, but like it just kind of plays home what I've seen in the most brutal adaptations of Beowulf, and just kind of made that hit home for me.
Yeah, all of the monsters are super gross and really interesting in this, and that one far and away the most gruesome and most interesting potentially.
And other references I was picking up on, did you notice anything with the naming conventions in this book?
What do you mean?
So some of these were kind of subtle references at first, like our main character being named Jason. Thought that might be a callback to the original Power Rangers team, since the first Red Ranger was Jason. That's the weakest of my comparisons, but after that, we start to see like almost biblical naming conventions here, and that the first wife that gives birth to this monster is named Lilith, which harkens back to like Hebrew legend and like Lilith, the first demon. I don't know, most of what I know about that character is coming from Supernatural, but like I feel like that one definitely couldn't have been a coincidence with her being a mother of monsters.
Oh yeah, I feel like that's done pretty often.
And the last one I felt pretty stupid because I didn't realize it until like 3 issues in, but the upcoming main character being named Noah, and they're the only survivor of a flood.
Okay, that's pretty on the nose.
Yeah, I mean, it's on the nose, but like it did take me 3 issues of this book to notice that, but I enjoyed the naming conventions used here. I'm not going to give them any gruff for that.
Huh. I guess I don't know is Noah even in the first issue?
Yeah, he's in the first issue, I mean, as the baby, of course, and then in the very tail end of the book, we see him as they're queuing up issue 2.
Like, is his name in the book?
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
They named the baby at least at one point.
Yeah, I totally missed out on all of that. It's good to see that there are other fun homages and references throughout the later issues.
Speaking of the later issues and what's coming up in this series, I was curious, as a newcomer to the genre and this comic, Grant, how likely are you to recommend this series to others going forward, based off this issue and what you've read so far?
So I've only read the first issue so far. Just based off that, this is something I would wholeheartedly recommend to anyone interested in reading comics, just because, like I've said, it has a complete story. It's so well done. It's just so easy to get into for those reasons. This is something I would definitely recommend to someone else.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because, I mean, obviously I'm definitely like a 10 on the scale of recommending this to people, with making a podcast about it, but I have read up to issue 3, which is all that's been released at the time of recording, and each issue has been great and maybe not quite as self-contained as this first issue, but still a fairly complete story, or at least a full experience. So even though each issue kind of cues up the next events or might have some level of cliffhanger to it, I still leave every issue feeling like I got an awesome comic book experience. So I don't really know what else I could ask for from a series, so that's obviously making me recommend this, not only based off an awesome first issue.
That's excellent. I'm looking forward to reading the next 2.
Yeah, so as someone who hasn't read further in the series, what are you hoping to see from this series going forward?
I'm really interested in a lot of the dystopian elements that they set up throughout the first issue, but they really capitalized on in the epilogue portion. It's clear some time has passed, and everything looks different. You know, it's a lot more Fallout. I'm getting vibes of some totalitarian regime being set up, and I'm really stoked to see what they carry through with that.
All right, and that's something we barely even touched on, just the epilogue setting up the next few issues. Again, a great job with concise storytelling, and that this opened with 4 pages telling us everything we needed to know about the hero, proceeds to give us 50 pages of an amazing kaiju fight in this world, and then wraps up with about 5 or 6 pages telling you everything you're going to need to know for issue 2. And I think you're going to be very happy with what you see in the next few issues, since the dystopian world they explore is very interesting and unlike the thousands of dystopian worlds I've seen before it. So I think you're really going to enjoy that. Me, on the other hand, I'm really hoping to see more references to the various franchises in this genre. I think there might be a subtle Kamen Rider reference in the end of issue 1 and the beginning of issue 2, but that might be, again, grasping at straws here. But as someone who knows a little bit about this genre and some of the most interesting movies and shows in it, I really hope this pulls from some of those, just to give me more reason to push people toward those shows and movies, and also just to indulge in a little bit of fan service here, because I've loved everything he's done so far in that regard.
Yeah, I think there, just from your mentions, there's been enough things that might be subtle references that I bet more often than not that's intentional, and it's not just you trying to find something.
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree there. The upcoming issues of this book even have a bit of a letters column where anybody can write in and get responses from the editor, and occasionally even James will chime in. And he himself mentions that he hasn't watched a ton of the movies and shows in this genre, at least the more obscure ones. But I'm willing to bet that there's going to be a lot of research done while this book is being written. And I bet there's going to be a lot more references to what the creative team is looking at along the way. And in researching this podcast, I'm watching a lot of movie shows and reading a lot of manga that ties in with this genre. I'm watching a lot of YouTube videos informing me about the history and behind the scenes of these things. So I think there's a lot of good content to pull from and a lot of awesome things to make reference or homage to that I will be surprised if that well goes untapped for the rest of this series. And those afterwards, by the way, are something I really wanted to touch on in this book, because after reading 60 pages of just awesome comic, we're left with this final note from the writer kind of telling us what he intends to do with this series and what he's pulling from for influence. And that really kind of helped my connection with this, because it just kind of confirmed everything I was thinking as I was reading this, that these guys know their stuff. They know this genre they're pulling from. And just to see their intentions stated so specifically here, and knowing that they're coming from a similar place of pulling from media that they enjoyed growing up but wasn't made for them growing up, really just resonates with me, because that's how I feel about so many entries in this genre, and this book now feels just like one of those, because it's got that level of, cheesiness and over-the-top action you would see in something like an episode of Power Rangers, but taking the audience seriously. This is something that you won't be allowed to watch for quite a number of years if your parents had any idea what's actually inside.
Yeah, and I really love some of the things that he said in that afterword, describing what this book was to him and then saying, I wonder how it'll turn out, or describing the influences of this and calling them things that felt like they were made by nerds swinging for the fences. And then it ends with thanks for giving it a try. So you can just really tell from that the writer and the creator really loved making this book, if it wasn't already clear from the book itself. And that was just really nice.
Yeah, and with the afterward bringing this book to a close, I'd kind of like to bring our episode to a close here as well. I would like to thank everyone listening for giving the first episode of our podcast a try. If you want to follow us on social media to follow upcoming episodes, we're on Facebook as Giant Size Violence and on Twitter as @UltraMegaCast. We hope you join us again in our upcoming episodes, where we'll be looking into the later issues of this series so far, as well as some of the movies and shows this comic draws influence from. Finally, I'd like to leave you with an excerpt from James Harren's afterword from issue 1. Honestly, I hope it leaves you as excited as we are for what this series has in store. I don't know much about it, but I love this genre. A colorful giant humanoid wrestling hand-to-hand with a giant tumorous dinosaur dipped in abstract art over a slate gray urban landscape. It's a glorious image. For whatever reason, I felt it necessary to take this image of fun, adolescent goof-em-ups and combine it with body horror and the grotesque consequence of power and human frailty. I wonder how it'll turn out.